December 8, 1941, 7 o'clock in the morning. Pearl Harbor. The air still trembled from the shock of the day before. Smoke rolled across the water like storm clouds trapped on the surface. Oil burned in slow circles, hissing against twisted steel. Battleships that had once been pride and power now lay half buried in the mud, masts pointing toward a sky that had betrayed them. The silence was heavier than the wrecks themselves. The world believed the Pacific Fleet was gone, that the heart of American sea power had stopped beating. But deep inside the black water, men were already preparing to descend. In darkness without glory, they would begin the impossible. In 3 years, they would raise a fleet from the dead. The morning after the attack, Pearl Harbor was not a harbor. It was a graveyard. The sea was coated in a thick film of oil, shimmering black and bronze under the Hawaiian sun. The smell of smoke mixed with salt and decay. Across Battleship Row, twisted masts jutted out of the water like monuments to defeat. The USS West Virginia, Oklahoma, California, and Nevada lay half-submerged, decks caved in, guns pointing nowhere. The Pacific Fleet, once the symbol of American strength, looked finished. Tokyo radio celebrated. Propaganda broadcasts declared the Pacific War already won. "The American fleet sleeps beneath its own waves," one announcer boasted. In Washington, even officials wondered if recovery was possible. How could a navy fight when its ships rested on the seabed? But in a small office near the dry docks, a quiet man was already sketching diagrams on paper stained with seawater. Commander Homer Wallin, a naval engineer who had witnessed the attack from shore, was appointed head of salvage operations. His task sounded absurd. Raise every ship that could still float, clean them, rebuild them, and send them back to war. He was told it might take a decade. He replied that he would do it in 3 years. Wallin's team began with almost nothing. The harbor was still burning. The water visibility was near zero. Divers wore heavy brass helmets and canvas suits, descending into oil thick enough to coat glass. The currents carried debris, plates, cables, rifles, through total darkness. They worked by touch, not sight, tracing hulls torn open by torpedoes. Communication lines often failed. Each dive risked entrapment or suffocation. Yet the orders never stopped. The Navy organized what would become the largest underwater engineering project in history. Pumps were built to force air into flooded compartments. Cranes hauled armor plates the size of houses. Mechanics drained thousands of tons of fuel. Every tool had to be invented for conditions no one had faced before. By the end of December, the fires were out, but the real battle had only begun. The men of the Pearl Harbor Salvage Division called themselves the Ghost Fleet Crew. They didn't fight with guns, but with patience and steel. And then, on December 20th, at 8:42 in the morning, a diver's boot touched the deck of the USS West Virginia. He wrote one word on his slate as bubbles drifted upward through black water. Reachable. The impossible suddenly had a starting point. The machine to raise the dead was about to awaken. By April of 1942, the divers had grown accustomed to darkness, but not to what waited inside it. The oil and silt that filled the ships hid more than machinery. When they finally cut through the lower decks of the USS West Virginia, the torchlight revealed a scene frozen in time. Tables are still set for breakfast, tools hanging where they'd been left, and behind a watertight door, the remains of sailors who had survived the initial attack but never escaped. Some had scrawled dates on the walls, marking the days they lived after the explosions. The divers paused their work. For a long time the pumps fell silent. Then, wordlessly, they sealed the compartment and surfaced. It was the only part of the operation where orders weren't needed. The salvage crews buried their grief in motion. Above the water, the transformation was visible. Nevada, the only battleship to get underway during the attack, was now fully refloated and towed into dry dock. California followed soon after, her decks cleaned of oil, guns stripped, and reinstalled. On the shore, welders worked under tarpaulin tents, sparks showering the night. Shipyard whistles sounded at 7 o'clock sharp each morning, and the cycle began again. Dive, patch, pump, weld, repeat. Every success carried a cost. The divers' suits grew heavy with layers of hardened oil. Compressors failed. Hoses burst. Some men surfaced unconscious from nitrogen buildup. Others refused rest entirely, working until their fingers bled through gloves. Yet morale remained unbroken. They called themselves the Undersea Army. By May, a rhythm of miracles began. On May 10th, California rose 15 feet. On June 3rd, the West Virginia stirred, her massive hull shifting against the harbor floor. Engineers on the surface watched the gauges climb. Pressure equalized, air trapped, pumps steady. Then, just after 7:30 that morning, the mud gave way. The ship trembled once and floated. Cheers erupted across the docks. Men who had worked for months without seeing sunlight finally stood shoulder to shoulder, watching a battleship rejoin the living. The flag that had been ripped away during the attack was raised again, this time over rust and scars. For the first time since December 7th, a sunken battleship moved under her own power, guided by tugs back to dry dock. But for Commander Wallin, it wasn't a celebration. It was validation. He looked at the rising hulls and saw something larger than recovery. He saw proof that a nation could rebuild itself underwater. And yet, this was only the beginning. The fleet was coming back, stronger, smarter, and more determined than ever. The ghosts of Pearl Harbor were no longer silent. By the summer of 1942, the salvage operation had become a machine unlike anything the Navy had ever built. A fusion of engineering, discipline, and quiet defiance. The attack that was meant to destroy America's fleet had instead forced it to evolve. Commander Homer Wallin's headquarters looked more like a factory floor than a naval office. Blueprints covered the walls. Maps tracked pump cycles, oxygen supply, and tidal patterns. Each ship had its own progress board marked with chalk. California, 82% buoyant. West Virginia, 63% sealed. Oklahoma, pending. Every line of data represented a life's worth of labor. To the untrained eye, the salvage division was chaos. Cranes groaning, compressors hissing, welding arcs flashing across the docks. But beneath the noise was a method. Crews rotated every 12 hours. Underwater teams reported data through coded signals. Divers worked in shifts of 20 minutes to avoid nitrogen sickness. Surface engineers synchronized pump rates so the hulls wouldn't twist under uneven pressure. It was not heroism. It was mathematics. The results were astonishing. In less than 2 years, 5 battleships, 3 cruisers, and 3 destroyers were restored from the seabed. More than 5 million man-hours logged. Nearly 200,000 tons of steel were resurrected. Fuel, ammunition, and even personal effects recovered. What had begun as a desperate experiment became a doctrine. Industrial salvage warfare. And it worked. The Japanese, facing similar losses at Truk and Rabaul, abandoned most of their wrecks. They lacked the machinery, the manpower, and the method. Their fleets decayed where they sank. The Americans, by contrast, built a system that turned destruction into productivity. In his journal, Wallin wrote a single line that defined the era. "We fought the sea as the enemy now." It was no exaggeration. The divers confronted pressure, darkness, and decay. The silent war below the surface. Each ship raised was a battle won against time itself. By 1943, California steamed under her own power again. West Virginia, rebuilt from her twisted frame, rejoined the fleet by 1944. Their decks bore the scars of Pearl Harbor, but their hearts, the engines, the guns, the steel, were reborn. The system had outmatched catastrophe. Coordination had replaced panic. Precision had replaced despair. And when those ships left the dry docks, their hulls freshly painted and flags snapping in the wind, the men who built them didn't cheer. They simply nodded to one another and started on the next. The Pacific Fleet wasn't rebuilt by miracles. It was rebuilt by measurement. By 1944, the harbor that once symbolized America's defeat had become its proof of endurance. The ships that had burned and sunk on that December morning now cut through the Pacific once more. Slower, perhaps, scarred beyond repair, but alive. The USS Nevada, repainted and refitted, steamed across the Atlantic to join the D-Day invasion. California and West Virginia returned to the Pacific, their guns firing at Leyte Gulf. The men who had once scraped mud from their decks now stood proudly upon them, watching the same guns roar again. From the air, Pearl Harbor no longer looked like a cemetery. The cranes were gone, replaced by the gleam of moving hulls. The smell of diesel had replaced the smell of smoke. Where the water had once been black, white wakes now spread behind the departing ships. The statistics told one story: 21 ships damaged or sunk, 16 returned to service. But the deeper story was human. The salvage teams, the welders, the engineers, men whose names were never printed in newspapers, had achieved what many thought impossible. They didn't avenge Pearl Harbor by destroying. They avenged it by restoring. Commander Wallin, now promoted to captain, watched the West Virginia depart the dock in May 1944. The ship that had once been crushed under 7 torpedoes and 2 bombs now moved with steady purpose. As she slipped past Ford Island, sailors on other ships saluted. Wallin didn't return the salute. He simply removed his cap and let the wind carry the salt mist across his face. The resurrected fleet carried a strange kind of power, not of vengeance, but of proof. Proof that technology could serve memory. Proof that defeat, if studied long enough, could become the foundation for victory. In total, the salvage effort cost less than building 2 new battleships, but restored more firepower than 10. It shortened the Pacific War by months, freeing new shipyards to produce carriers, submarines, and landing craft. When the West Virginia opened fire at Leyte Gulf later that year, one officer quietly said to another, "That ship was dead once." The reply came like a prayer: "Not anymore." By 1945, the harbor that had once been hell on earth had become the beating heart of the world's largest naval force. Pearl Harbor was no longer just a place of loss. It was proof that steel could remember. And in the silence after the war, the ghosts of the harbor finally rested. Because they had been seen, raised, and carried forward. By the spring of 1945, the waters of Pearl Harbor were calm again. The waves that had once carried fire now shimmered blue, disturbed only by the hum of passing ships. But beneath that still surface, history lingered. The divers who had worked in the darkness still dreamed of it. The pressure in their chests, the flicker of torchlight against rusted steel, the quiet knock of hammers echoing through flooded decks. They had spent years breathing through hoses, fighting against silence and weight. Some had nearly drowned, others never surfaced, yet none of their names appeared on medals or parades. Their victory was invisible, measured not in enemies destroyed, but in ships reborn. Visitors who arrived after the war saw only a harbor restored. They saw the West Virginia gleaming with fresh paint, the Nevada preparing to sail again, and cranes dismantled as though the work had been easy. What they didn't see were the nights when those same ships were hollow shells, when the men beneath them worked by touch alone, writing messages to one another on slates because voices could not carry through the black. Commander Homer Wallin never called himself a hero. When asked years later how he accomplished it, he simply said, "We kept going." But his team knew the truth, that perseverance can be louder than revenge, that rebuilding requires more courage than destroying. At sunset, the harbor lights reflected off the newly risen ships, dancing across the rippling water like memories refusing to fade. The same docks that had once echoed with explosions now carried laughter again. The clang of tools replaced by the ring of Liberty bells, the hiss of torches replaced by the whistle of departing ships. The fleet that rose from the mud of Pearl Harbor would fight again across 2 oceans. But their true legacy was not written in battles won or miles sailed. It was written in the quiet resolve of men who refused to let their country's first defeat define its destiny. They didn't just salvage ships, they salvaged faith. And in that act, they proved that strength isn't measured by how many blows you can deliver, but by how many you can recover from. In time, Pearl Harbor became more than a memorial. It became a mirror. Every war since has reflected something of its lesson. That devastation, however complete, can be undone by order, patience, and unity. The ships raised from its depths carried those lessons across the world. Nevada, the only battleship to sail through both Pearl Harbor and Normandy, fired her guns again in 1944, bombarding German positions on the beaches of France. California and West Virginia returned to the Pacific, firing broadside salvos at Leyte Gulf, their decks trembling not from attack, but from rebirth. To the young sailors who boarded them, these ships were simply tools of war. But to the men who had once welded their wounds shut beneath the waves, they were living proof that nothing stays lost forever. Every strike, every recoil of those guns was a heartbeat. The sound of resurrection made audible. After the war, when the noise of the Pacific quieted and the world began to rebuild, the lessons of Pearl Harbor seeped into everything America built. Shipyards, cities, even ideals. Engineers spoke of Wallin's discipline, the belief that precision and patience could overcome even disaster. Divers went on to design the first underwater cutting torches used in Cold War salvage. The Navy built schools dedicated to recovery, not destruction. And perhaps most enduring of all, the harbor itself was transformed. Where the attack had begun the war, the reconstruction had ended it. Pearl Harbor became the symbol of both ruin and renewal, proof that nations could fall in the morning and rise by dusk. Today, divers still descend into the lagoon, gliding past coral-encrusted turrets and rusted decks. Shafts of light pierce the green water, revealing the outlines of ships that once burned and then lived again. Fish drift through open hatches once sealed with human hands. Time has turned tragedy into history, and history into warning. The wrecks sleep now, not as graves but as guardians. They remind every generation that no defeat is final, that even beneath the heaviest silence, movement is still possible. And when the waves lap against the shore of Ford Island, they sound almost like breathing, the slow, patient rhythm of a harbor that refused to die. In the end, America's greatest act of war was not its fury, but its recovery, not its destruction, but its decision to rebuild. To see where those resurrected ships fought again, watch USS Nevada led the charge on D-Day, the ship that refused to die,